This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
In our previous lesson, we took a look at the parable of the husbandman. And in that story, remember, there was a certain landowner who went to a far country, and he let out the land he owned to these husbandmen. And when it was time for fruit to be received, he sent a servant to these husbandmen. The husbandman wickedly treated this man, treated him wickedly, and then sent him off. So the owner sent another servant, and they treated him poorly and sent him off. They sent a third, and they treated him brutally and sent him off. And so finally the owner of the land decided he would send his son, thinking surely they would reverence him. Wouldn't that make sense? And it makes sense to all of us. That's why their ill treatment of him is such a surprise and shock. They decided when they saw him coming that they would murder him, and then the land would become theirs. But of course Jesus, in finishing up the story, says that the owner of the land would come and he would destroy these wicked husbandmen and give the land to others. Now, at that point, Jesus' religious opponents are saying, "Be it not so," or "No way, Hosea," as some people say in the United States, or "May it never be." The older translations render it "God forbid," but it is that Greek expression, "me genoito." And the reason they said this could never be is for two reasons. Number one, they perceived that he spoke this parable against them. Of course, they were rejecting or refusing to recognize him as the Christ. I don't know, maybe there's a subtle difference here, but it may not be quite right to say they rejected him, but to say that they refused to acknowledge who he was. Of course, in so doing, they do reject him. But it's not because the evidence was not sufficient. The evidence was so sufficient that God could hold these people in contempt for the way they treated the Son. And secondly, the reason why this parable didn't make sense to those to whom Jesus spoke it was that the thought of the blessings that were to accompany the saved being given to the Gentiles repulsed Jesus' audience. Many of them thought the promises of God to Abraham were exclusively the right and ownership of the Jews. Now, interesting, when you go back and rehearse those promises to Abraham, such as in Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis 22, where the Lord said that he would make of Abraham a great nation. He that blesses him, God would bless. Whoever cursed Abraham, God would curse. And in him or in his seed would all the nations, notice that, nations, plural, or all the families, plural, of the earth would be blessed. What did the Jew think when he read those texts? I've often wondered that. What did the Jew in the days of Jesus, or even prior to that time, think when they read those promises recorded by Moses that God had given to Abraham? Did they think, because certainly the Jews in general did not see that this was for the Jews, the Gentiles in the days of Christ. They were very puzzled by it, and it was something that takes up a lot of space in the New Testament as various writers explain and expound how both Jews and Gentiles become joint heirs and fellow workers and fellow heirs in the kingdom. But when they read passages like Genesis 12, where God said all the nations or families of the earth would be blessed, the only thing I can come up with is they must have thought something like the nations of the earth or all the families of the earth would be blessed by the presence of us Jews. Maybe that's what they had in mind as they read those texts. But that's certainly not what God had in mind. God had in mind opening his blessings to every person who would, hearing the gospel, obey in faith as a manifestation of their love for him. Now it seems, back to our study in Luke chapter 20, that with every step, Jesus' opponents escalate their efforts to destroy him. The conflict compounds with every breath. In Luke 20, verses 20 through 26, they tried to trap him again. The text says, so as to deliver him up to the rule and to the authority of the governor. Let's take a look at that briefly. Luke chapter 20, verses 21 through 26. We'll look back at verse 20. And they watched him and sent forth spies who feigned themselves to be righteous, that they might take hold of his speech, so as to deliver him up to the rule and the authority of the governor. And they asked him, saying, Teacher, we know that thou sayest and teachest rightly, and acceptest not the person of any, but of a truth you teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute unto Caesar or not? But he perceived their craftiness, and said unto them, Show me a denarius. Whose image and superscription hath it? And they said, Caesar's. And he said unto them, Then render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And they were not able to take hold of the saying before the people, and they marveled at his answer and held their peace. I marvel at Jesus' perfect response in every situation. He always said the right thing in the right way at the right time for the right reason. Jesus was the characterization of prudence in the flesh and wisdom. Well, in Luke 20, verses 27 through 40, the Sadducees try to trick him again with questions concerning the resurrection. We'll look at that in just a moment. First, they tried to trap him with a political question in the text we just read in verses 20 through 26. And then they tried to trick him with a spiritual question, or a question about the spirit realm. And they failed on both accounts. It is truly amazing how spiteful and irrational a person can be when they set themselves against God and against his truth. When they questioned his authority at the beginning of this chapter, chapter 20, Jesus placed his opponents on the horns of a dilemma. And of course, it was only a dilemma for those who opposed Jesus as the Christ. When they questioned him concerning tribute paid to Caesar, Luke tells us, this is from the New International Version, they were unable to trip him in what he said there in public, and astonished by his answer, they became silent. In response to the Sadducees' question concerning the resurrection, one of the scribes had to admit in verse 40, Teacher, thou hast well said, or from the NIV, and no one dared to ask him any more questions. Now we are looking ahead a bit here at the beginning of this lesson to try to help you see what's coming ahead and how it fits into what we've already seen. But for such a long time in the gospel, according to Luke, Jesus had set his face toward Jerusalem and was heading toward Jerusalem. Now he's in Jerusalem, and the minute he gets to Jerusalem, the pace of Luke's account slows down, and it focuses in on the events of that last week. This pretty much marks the end of all talks in the end of verse 20, or chapter 20. At this point, Jesus' opponents could do nothing but one thing: to hire liars that would bear false witness concerning him and to have him put to death. Their motivation for such an irrational and ungodly thing is found at the very end of Luke chapter 20. Beginning in verse 45, And in the hearing of all the people, he said unto his disciples, Beware of the scribes, who desire to walk in long robes, and love salutations in the marketplaces, and chief seats in the synagogues, and chief places at feasts, who devour widows' houses, and for pretense make long prayers. These shall receive greater condemnation. Well, I'll tell you, I don't know a lot of folks who would have said that. But Jesus was not afraid to speak the truth and to expound on the ungodly condition of the hearts of these opponents. John the Baptizer's attitude toward Jesus was that he, John, must decrease while Jesus increases. Was that the same attitude the scribes and Pharisees had of Jesus' day, where their relationship with him was concerned? Not one bit. They weren't willing to concede any 1 inch of ground in their status. That's why Jesus in Matthew 23 renounces them some 8 times by crying out, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites." A hypocrite is someone who pretends to be something he is not without a view toward becoming what he pretends to be. The reason I put it that way is because I know that as Christians we are not what we want to be. We are all striving to become more Christ-like, to have Christ formed in us. And we try to do things the very best we can the way Jesus would do them. But we sometimes fail. That doesn't make us a hypocrite. It simply means we're trying and working toward and pressing onward and working to fashion within us by the sculpting power of the Word of God, Christ in us, to be like Christ, to be lights in this world just as Jesus is the light of the world. And when we fail, that does not mean we're hypocrites, because we do intend to become the way we act, both in attitude and emphasis and motivation in life. Well, our study of the Gospel according to Luke has brought us to the remaining few days of our Lord prior to His crucifixion. We have traced His steps from Bethphage and Bethany into Jerusalem, where He entered the temple and taught daily. His antagonists have already confronted Him, once in an effort to stump Him and to ridicule Him before an audience that adores Him. But that audience, let me remind you, is very fickle, and we'll see how in the upcoming days in the text. The Sanhedrin, made up of the chief priests, the scribes and Pharisees, or principal men, sought to destroy Him, according to Luke 19, verse 47. And having failed in their initial attempt, they sent forth spies who pretended to be righteous, that they might catch Him in something. He said, so that they could deliver Him to the ruler and the authority of the governor. Luke 20, verse 20. When the Sanhedrin came out in their initial display of force, Jesus put them on the uncomfortable horns of a dilemma, if you'll recall, from Luke 20, verses 1 through 8. Jesus then told the parable of the husbandman in Luke 20, verses 9 through 18. And the scribes and chief priests perceived that He spoke this parable against them. Now, if you're the kind of student you should be, you'll have pencil and pen in hand, and you'll be jotting these down, because I am giving you the breakdown of the Gospel of Luke. At least you can compare my breakdown of it with what you've done, and this will help you toward your work in that final paper. They then conspired to send spies out to trap Him. They thought perhaps to catch Him in some political discrepancy. Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not, they asked in chapter 20, verse 22. But Jesus saw through their real motives and said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. In verse 26, notice their response. They were not able to hold on, they were not able to take hold on or of the saying before the people, and they marveled at His answer and held their peace. Then the Sadducees came with a clever scenario involving marriage and the afterlife, again to test Him. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record this incident, and all three writers inform us of the doctrinal peculiarity of the Sadducees. They say there is no resurrection. The doctrine of a resurrection isn't all they denied. When Paul was before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 23, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Luke tells us that the Sadducees say that, quote, there is no resurrection, neither angels nor spirit, but the Pharisees confessed both. Acts 23 verse 28, which meant that Paul was pretty smart here in bringing up the issue of the resurrection, knowing that his audience was divided. J.W. McGarvey argues that the Sadducees' denial of such things as spirit was the root from which their other errors sprang forth as branches. If the Sadducees denied all these ideas, why then would they ask Jesus a question concerning a woman that involved the resurrection, something they did not believe? Well, they too sought to trap him by placing him in a bind. It was a question that the Pharisees had trouble with because they believed life would go on in the hereafter much as it does in the here and now. Let's take a look at the story itself. In chapter 20 of Luke, verses 27 through 39. And there came to him certain of the Sadducees, they that say there is no resurrection, and they asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote unto us that if a man's brother die, having a wife, and he be childless, his brother should take the wife, and raise up seed unto his brother. There were therefore 7 brethren, and the first took a wife, and died childless. And the second and the third took her, and likewise the 7th, or the 7 also left no children, and died. Afterward the woman also died. Notice this question from these cagey fellows. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife of them shall she be? For the 7 had her to wife. And Jesus said unto them, The sons of this world marry and are given in marriage, but they that are accounted worthy to attain to that world and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for neither can they die any more, for they are equal unto the angels, and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the place concerning the bush, when he called the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living. For all live unto him. And a certain of the scribes answering said, Teacher, thou hast well said. For they durst not any more ask him any questions. Now Luke's account is a bit more helpful in showing us how Jesus' answer responds to the Sadducees' question. In Matthew's account, it is a bit more obscure. It's obscured a bit more, not to the hearer of the day, but to us so far removed from the situation and the issue, and I'll explain why in a moment. The first thing the Sadducees did was to cite Moses' injunction that if a man's brother dies, having a wife and she is childless, the brother should take the wife and raise up seed unto his brother. That's in Luke 20, verse 28, and a reference to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5. Now here's the scenario they set before Jesus. There were 7 brothers. The first brother took a wife, and he died childless. The second and third and so on up to the 7th then married her, one at a time, of course, and each one died successively. They all left her childless, after which she died. So we have a woman married 7 times to 7 brothers successively, and then they all died. Now the question from verse 33 is, In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife of them shall she be? For the 7 had her to wife. Well, with this clever question, they thought to ridicule, I think, the whole idea of a resurrection and the afterlife. Jesus was the only one uniquely qualified to answer this question, because he is the only one to have left heaven as the Father of eternities, from his appellation in Isaiah 9 verse 6, to take up residence in this life, and so he speaks with authority on the matter. The first thing he did was to correct their notion that all things in the hereafter correspond with life as we now know it. He said that the sons of this world marry, but in the hereafter they neither marry nor are given in marriage. They die no more. They are equal to the angels, and they are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. He then makes an appeal to Moses' writings. Notice the Sadducees made the first appeal to Moses. Jesus makes an appeal to the same authority. And we're told that in the place concerning the bush that was burning, when he called the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. That's from Exodus chapter 3 verse 15. If I'm not mistaken, the Sadducees only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament anyway. And that's, of course, the cluster from which Jesus is quoting. Jesus then affirms this: God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live unto him. Now, Brother Thomas Warren, in his book Immortality, has broken down this argument for us. Premise number 1, since God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Number 2, and since God is the God of the living and not of the dead, the conclusion is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob must still be living in spite of their having experienced physical death many years before the incident at hand. Now, the question that puzzled me for years, and I just could not understand it at first, was how Jesus' answer actually answers the Sadducees' question about resurrection. I could not see it, especially studying it from Matthew's account. I don't know if having studied it from Luke's account would have helped me much more. But it wasn't until I read in the Expositor's Bible Commentary D.A. Carson's discussion on this text that it helped me make sense of it. Dr. Carson suggests that at first glance Jesus' argument may seem sufficient to prove immortality, but not resurrection. And that's the problem I had. As far as I was concerned, all Jesus had proven in his discussion with the Sadducees was that in the hereafter, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were existing. It didn't say anything about the resurrection. Remember, James chapter 2 ends by saying the body apart from the spirit is dead. Well, the body returns to dust. The spirit returns to God who gave it, Solomon writes in the book of Ecclesiastes. So all Jesus' argument, as far as I was concerned at the time, proved was that there is immortality, that man lives after death, but it didn't say anything with reference, I thought at first, to the resurrection. That's where I was mistaken. Resurrection, listen carefully, and I know that if you are like I am, you're going to have to go over this in your mind several times until it finally dawns on you what's happening. Resurrection is proven in Jesus' answer to the Sadducees when we realize that the Sadducees' concern was not to choose between immortality and resurrection, but between death as finality and life after death. Let me say that again. The resurrection of the body, which was the nature of their question, whose wife shall she be in the resurrection? Of course, that's an event they denied happened, that they said would not and did not believe would happen. But resurrection is proven when we realize that the Sadducees' concern was not to choose between immortality and resurrection. If that were the case, then all Jesus would have proven was immortality, but nothing about resurrection. But the real debate was whether death is the finality of all things or whether there's life beyond death. Let's develop that further. This being the case, once Jesus proved there is life beyond death, the resurrection follows. And it follows in this fashion. Man is viewed as a composite in the Scriptures, as body and spirit. Man is not, and this, I don't know, maybe someone could write me if you know this, but I am assuming that this whole idea that man is nothing more than a spirit trapped in a cave, which is how the body is viewed, is more Platonic. In other words, it's an idea that we got from Plato, not from Scripture. Because man is viewed in the Bible as a composite unit of body and spirit, or sometimes body, soul, and spirit. Man is, the essence of man is not just in that he's a spirit. If that were the case, then the mere physical dimension of man would be nothing more than a cave that he is provided through which he views the world through his various senses. Listen to this. This is a quotation from Dr. Carson. Our problem is that we force on the text a Neoplatonian dualism. Now, that's a mouthful, but what he's talking about is this dualistic concept of man being body and spirit. And Plato thought that man's essence was his spirit and not his body, that his body was something more like a cave through which he viewed things. And some people today have taken that and concluded that in death we are freed from our cave. Well, if that were the case and our body was nothing more than something in which, or something that confined us, why would we want to be confined again in the hereafter? So death to them is viewed as nothing more than a release from the cave. Let me read this. Our problem is that we force on the text a Neoplatonian dualism and demand a choice between immortality and resurrection, and that's not what Jesus is doing. Mr. Geldenhuys, in his New International Critical Commentary on Luke, wrote this: real life in the biblical sense is life in soul and in body alike. Therefore, immortality in the biblical sense includes resurrection, meaning a union of the soul with the glorified spiritual body. Of course, he puts spiritual in quotations, and that's a reference to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, a text we'll look at in a moment. Dr. Walter Liefeld, in his commentary on Luke, in the Expositor's Bible Commentary, writes, note the repetition of the word resurrection and the absence of any reference to the Greek concept of immortality. It is not persistence of life, but that the dead rise that Jesus is teaching. The point is this, and I hope I can get this idea across. It's not, because when we say it's not a distinction between immortality and resurrection, what we're saying is this. It is one thing to say that at death the spirit returns to God and that's it. It is another thing to say that at some point in a later time, after death, the body is raised from the dead and reunited with the spirit. Now the question is, how does Jesus' response to the Sadducees prove resurrection? After all, that's the question they were asking. Whose wife shall she be in the resurrection? Here's how Jesus proves it. If Jesus can prove that there is a survival of the spirit after death, that there is life after death, the concept of resurrection follows. The Sadducees denied a life after death. So, if Jesus could prove to them, from Scripture they accepted, that man survives death, then the resurrection follows by implication. Now, how did Jesus prove that man survives death? By saying, in reverting back to this statement, or going back to Exodus 3:15, look at Luke 20 again, verse 37. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed. How did Moses show that the dead are raised? So that's why Luke's account is a bit more helpful to me, at least, than reading it strictly from Matthew's account. Moses showed this in the place concerning the bush when he called the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now Jesus said, "Now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live unto him." Conclusion, if God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, and when Moses spoke of Abraham, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he didn't say he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All three of those patriarchs were dead and gone long before this was ever uttered at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, verse 15. Jesus is then proving that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob exist. Now they exist in spirit, but that they exist in spirit implied that there would be a resurrection that followed. The problem I had is that's not explicitly stated here, but it is implied. And being implied, it is just as true as if it had been explicitly stated. In fact, Jesus himself says that the dead are raised, even Moses showed. Well, how did Moses show that? He showed it in that he said, because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did survive death, the death of the body, by implication the body would raise. Now, I guess I could go over and over that, but you can rewind this over and over again and listen to it until you understand what I'm trying to say. And I would encourage you to work through this because it is such a crucial doctrine in Scripture. And the reason I've spent some time with it, and we're going to spend a little more time in a moment by looking at some passages in, for example, 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15, is because I have run across so many Christians who have lived unaware for decades that the Bible teaches that our bodies will one day be raised and changed from the dead and reunited with our spirit. It's such a prominent doctrine. It puzzles me and, in fact, disturbs me a little bit that people who should have known by virtue of the amount of time they've been Christians, and yet do not see this foundational doctrine or teaching in the Bible. You might be one of those folks. What I'm saying to you might sound bizarre and peculiar to you. What you're going to have to do is ask yourself questions about what do you know about the nature of man and what makes up man. Do you recall back in the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis that God created man from the dust of the ground? Let me say that again. God created man from the dust of the ground. If I were to ask you, what did God create from the dust of the ground, what would you say? You'd have to say man. You see, man is not just spirit, but he's also clay. He was created from the dust of the ground, and God made him a living spirit when he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. That the body is under discussion where resurrection is concerned, I think, can clearly be demonstrated. Let's look at a couple of texts. In fact, I see that our time is about up, so this might be a good place for us to stop. But let me ask you, in preparation for our next class, to read 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. Of course, you want to read before and after to make sure you understand it in its context. And then, if you would, read 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 39 through 45. Add to that Romans chapter 8, verse 23, Philippians chapter 3, verses 20 and 21, and then John chapter 5, verses 28 and 29. And we'll survey those texts together. If you're in a class setting, be sure that you discuss these things amongst yourselves. And if you have any questions, take advantage of the instructor you have there in your class. And perhaps he can help you and guide you in understanding these things better. But until then, I really hope that you'll grab hold of these things and recognize what wonderful hope God has set before us as Christians. Hope that that will function as an anchor of the soul, according to the writer of Hebrews. And I pray that God bless you with understanding that, and that, as Paul put it, the eyes of your heart may be enlightened to understand these great truths. Until then, may God bless you.